Hi, and welcome to Why Do Countries Exist, Episode 48, The History of Croatia. So today's drink of choice is Plavac Mali. Plavac Mali is a Croatian red wine coming from Dalmatia, a region famous for its wine. Croatia, while not as famous for its wines as France or Italy, does have a long history producing wine, going back to pre-Roman times, and it's one of the biggest wine producers in the world today. Plavac Mali itself for a while was believed to be the ancestor of Zinfandel wine. The wine I got overall was pretty good. It has kind of the taste of cloves. I think it's maybe the most red wine I've ever had. It was overall a solid wine and something I would probably have again, although I only found it in two stores, one 2 hours away and another one only occasionally, so it's probably not going to be something I drink on the regular. Croatia is located in the Balkans in southeastern Europe. It has the Adriatic Sea to the southwest, Bosnia and Herzegovina and a tiny stretch of Montenegro to the southeast, Serbia to the east, Hungary to the north, and Slovenia to the northwest. Croatia has three general geographic regions. There is the Pannonian lowlands in the north kind of center of the country, which is temperate and heavily populated, with some hills along the border with Serbia. There are the Dinaric Alps, which are mountainous and hilly in the western central part of the country. And then there is the Adriatic coast, which is warmer with a Mediterranean climate, although still remaining quite hilly. Overall, Croatia's climate is pretty warm and temperate. Croatia has a little under 3.9 million people in it. Almost all people in Croatia are ethnic Croats, with over 90% being ethnic Croat. The largest minority group in the country are the Serbs, with almost 5% being Serbian. Croatia's Serbs are primarily found along the border with Serbia and in the Dinaric region along the western border with Bosnia. Other minority groups include the Romani, Italians, Hungarians, Czechs, Albanians, Bosniaks, and many more ethnic communities, often from ex-Yugoslavia, the Balkans, or Central Europe. Language-wise, Croatian is the official language of the country. It is a South Slavic language very similar to Serbian and Bosniak, so much so many consider it essentially the same language. However, important to know Croatian is written in Latin, while Serbian, the language of, unsurprisingly, the Serb minority, is written in Cyrillic. There are also several dialects of Croatian within the country that complicate things. Other languages like English, German, and/or Italian are also spoken by many as a second language. Finally, religion-wise, Croatian is a very Christian and Catholic country. Roman Catholicism is by far the largest denomination, with almost 90% being Catholic and dominant pretty much everywhere in the country. Eastern Orthodox are the next largest religious group, with most Orthodox being ethnic Serbs or other minority groups. Other religious groups like Protestants, Old Catholics, Muslims, Jews, Neo-Pagans, and Buddhists are also present. Finally, a little less than 10% are non-religious. For tens of thousands of years, people have been living in Croatia. Indo-Europeans arrived in the 3000s BCE, with various cultures and people groups inhabiting the area. By the 500s BCE, a group known as the Illyrians would make up much of what is now Croatia, along with most of former Yugoslavia. The Illyrians were made up of several tribes and small kingdoms that fought each other and neighboring peoples, engaging in slave raids, building humble but highly defensive hill forts, and coming into conflict with a limited number of Greek colonists who founded settlements along the Adriatic Sea. The Illyrians would be replaced by the Romans, although this wasn't a quick process. The first conflict between Rome and the Illyrians would occur in 229 BCE with a Roman punitive expedition against Illyrian pirates. What would follow would be several centuries of conflict between Rome and the Illyrians, with Rome increasingly pushing into Illyrian territory, sometimes signing treaties with Illyrian leaders, other times going to war and conquering them. The final conflict would begin in 6 CE, with a major revolt by several Illyrian tribes attempting to throw off the Roman yoke. However, after a couple years, they were defeated with Croatia and the Balkans brought under Roman rule. Roman rule would see the first major city start to be built. The capital of the province of Dalmatia, Salona, would be particularly notable. It was a major port in the region and was a multicultural city with Romans, Illyrians, Greek Jews, and many other people groups all living in the city. Roads were built throughout the territory, with mineral and agricultural products from the region being exported out to the rest of the empire. Maybe one of the biggest benefits the region gave to Rome was in fighting men, with many men from what would now be Croatians serving in Rome's legions, and 3 emperors being born in Croatia. Christianity would also be introduced into the region by the 2nd century. In the late 400s, Roman rule in the region would cease as barbarians from the east moved in to eat up the dying Roman Empire. Various new Germanic and Slavic peoples would enter Croatia. The Byzantines would try to hold on to power, with Justinian retaking the territory in the mid-500s. However, Byzantine rule wouldn't last long, and they would for the next several centuries only cling on to some small cities and outposts on the coast. Another Roman successor, the Holy Roman Empire under Charlemagne and the Carolingians, managed to take parts of Croatia in the late 700s, but it was more of a periphery region. It was during this time that the first mentions of the Croatian or Hrvati people would start to emerge. There is some debate on if the Croats were a Slavic people or a Central Asian people who had been Slavicized. But regardless, they became the dominant ethnic group in Croatia in the early medieval period, with Croats intermixing and mingling with Slavic groups, the Avars, and the remaining Illyrians and anyone else in the region. The Croats would start to develop their own state while under Carolingian suzerainty. Admittedly, Carolingian rule faded quickly, but it did give them some space for several Croat leaders to build their own polity. The Western Church would encroach into Croatia, with its leaders and population being baptized into the Latin Church, although the interior would see Slavic-speaking churches continue to hold out until the 900s. An important Croatian ruler during this time would be Trpimir I, the Duke of Croatia from 845 to 864. He would form the Trpimirović dynasty, which would be the ruling family of Croatia for the next several centuries. The Trpimirović power base would be centered around its capital in Klis, with the Dalmatian coast and parts of western Bosnia under the control of the state. Over the years, it would expand north and towards the interior. The state would reach its height in 925, when the then Duke, Tomislav, was crowned King of Croatia, founding the Kingdom of Croatia, which for a moment held roughly Croatia minus the north and Bosnia. However, after Tomislav's death in 928, civil war would break out and the Croatian king's power was greatly weakened. While rulers like Peter Kashmir, who would also help solidify Croatia being a part of the Western Church, in the mid-1000s would halt its decline, Croatia quickly became absorbed by other rising powers in the region, namely Hungary and Venice. Hungary in particular started to make inroads in the Croatian court, with the Trpimirovićes marrying into the Hungarian royal family. In 1091, the last Trpimirović died, which led to the Hungarians claiming Croatia as theirs. Some Croatian nobles would try to resist, but the last Croatian king would be killed at the Battle of Gvozd Mountain in 1097. This would see Croatia absorbed into the Kingdom of Hungary, and the next roughly 900 years would see Croatia under foreign rule. But all of Croatia wouldn't actually fall under Hungarian rule. As stated earlier, Venice was growing at this time, and they were able to hold onto several colonies in the Adriatic, with the Styrian Peninsula, and several cities in Dalmatia, like Zadar, all falling under their control. These colonies would be particularly important as a source of manpower. Skipping ahead several centuries, Benjamin Curtis in his book A Traveler's History of Croatia says 8% of the entire population of Venetian Dalmatia would serve in the Battle of Lepanto against the Ottoman Turks in 1571. Besides Venice, several small city-states would also exist along the Adriatic coast. Perhaps most notable would be the Republic of Dubrovnik. While at points the city was a tributary to other empires like the Byzantines or Venice, it was often de facto independent and became one of the most important port cities in the Mediterranean. It was one of the most cosmopolitan cities in Europe with some of the best living standards on the continent. An aristocratic republic was established with noble families giving a certain degree of democracy. Meanwhile, in Croatia proper, Hungary was now in charge, but that didn't mean Croatia disappeared. Croatia was joined with Hungary under a personal union with the Kingdom of Croatia, still technically existing and autonomy given. A ruler known as the Ban administered the state, while various Croatian nobles could also make their voices heard in the Croatian parliament, or Sabor. Despite this autonomy, there were several rebellions and noble plots to throw off Hungarian rule. Notably, Bosnia would be separated from Croatia in the 1100s with the formation of the Banat of Bosnia. Let's take a brief look at the Croatian economy and social life. Croatia's economy was primarily agricultural based, with products like grains, cereals, grapes, wines, and olives all being produced. Other economic exports would also include products from animal herding, forestry, salt mining, fish, and especially along the coast, shipbuilding and slaves. Slavery on the coast would be a little ironic, considering the coast was the part of the country where peasants were the freest under the Kolinat system, while the interior had a more traditional serf model. By the 1300s-1400s, the first theological schools were built, the population increased, and Italian and German merchants frequently immigrated, setting up shop in Croatia's major cities. Italians in particular would make up a large chunk of Dalmatia and Styria all the way up until the mid-1900s. The later medieval period was a relatively peaceful period in the country. This would change in the mid-1400s, as the Ottomans began pushing north into Europe. The next roughly 200 years would see Croatia as a battlefield as Ottoman forces raided undefended Croatian settlements, depopulating large segments of the rural countryside and taking many into slavery and forcing many north. Croatian nobles attempted to fight off the Ottoman forces, but they were often unable to defend their long border with the Ottomans and too weak to actually defeat them. Several small city-states along the coast were swallowed up, Venice's power in the region was weakened, and Dubrovnik only skipped by swearing fealty to the Ottomans. The remaining Croatian cities fortified themselves. The Battle of Krbave Field would see many of Croatia's nobles killed, and in 1526, the Battle of Mohačes would see the Hungarian king, along with 30,000 other Hungarian and Croatian soldiers killed, which ended up giving the Croatian crown to the Habsburgs, ending Hungarian rule in Croatia, or at the very least the Hungarian king being the ruler of Croatia. By 1526, Croatia was divided between Venice and Dubrovnik pressed right on the coast, Austria holding on to the center and north, while the Ottomans held everything else. Venice's colonies stagnated over the next 3 centuries as the Ottomans forced them to only their most fortified cities and cut them off from trade in the interior, while piracy hurt merchant profits. In Ottoman Croatia, some migration from other neighboring areas helped regrow the depopulated region. Muslim soldiers and administrators were brought in, and in Croatia, a limited number of Croatian peasants did convert to Islam. The bigger demographic change would come from Orthodox Christians who were brought over from Serbia. Slowly, parts of Slavona and the region around Karlovac began to become majority Orthodox. Ottoman rule did see some social improvement as feudalism was abolished, and those who converted to Islam could see some advancement, but this came at the cost of the Christian majority becoming second-class citizens, with almost 60% of Croatia depopulated and hundreds of settlements and religious sites destroyed. Austrian Croatia would be divided in two. The northern part, away from the Ottoman frontier, remained under civil control, technically serving as an autonomous subdivision within the Kingdom of Hungary, which was its own subdivision of the Habsburg Empire. The majority of Austrian Croatia would become a military frontier. This military frontier was designed to prevent and combat Ottoman advances into Austria. Compulsory military service for all men in the territory was instated, and labor for infrastructure projects was also required. However, serfs living in the frontier were freed, and taxes were kept to the bare minimum. It also saw large-scale immigration into it, encouraged by the Habsburgs to repopulate the region and shore up their defenses. Many Croats, Serbs, and Vlachs fleeing Ottoman territory would settle in Croatia, but also some Germans, Jews, Ruthenians, and Hungarians moved into the region, serving as mercenaries or administrators. The Croatian economy over the next 300-ish years would become pretty much solely based on agriculture. The military frontier for many years had a hazy border, as wars between Austria and the Ottomans saw the border frequently change. After the Great Turkish War, the war which had the famous Battle of Vienna, was finished in 1699, the border between Austrian Croatia and Ottoman Bosnia became more defined and roughly followed the border of current Croatia and Bosnia today. While the Band-Aid of Bosnia had separated Bosnia from Croatia centuries ago, this line helped solidify this division. Some limited advancements were made in the 1700s, with the first universities being built, and a middle class slowly starting to emerge, but Croatia at the time was mainly just a source of fighting men for the Habsburgs. Croatian nobles tried at several points to fight for more autonomy for Croatia, even at one point plotting to gain independence, but these plans were largely for naught. However, the 18th century would see some changes as the age of nationalism, liberalism, and revolution swept Europe. In 1797, Venice would be conquered by Napoleon, with its Croatian territory falling to Austria. In 1809, France in the War of the Fifth Coalition would take most of Croatia, setting up the Illyrian provinces, with Dubrovnik's independence ended, and Austria with just Slavonia. France's rule would modernize the country, with new schools and roads built, the church's power weakened, new products like tobacco and potatoes entering the country, and feudalism being abolished. While France's rule didn't ever really receive widespread support, the French did try to promote the Croat language in schooling, which earned it the support of some proto-Croatian nationalists. In 1814, Napoleon would be crushed in the War of the Sixth Coalition, with France's Illyrian provinces returned to Austria, with many of the radical proposals reversed, and what is now Croatia divided between several different administrative units. While France's rule was short-lived, it did have some important impacts into Croatian society and history, ended with all of Croatia firmly under the Austrian banner, and serves as a good stepping stone into Croatian nationalism that follows. Speaking of Croatian nationalism, let's start talking about the Illyrian movement. As early as the 1600s, Croatian writers were romanticizing the Illyrians of yore, and panning over an imagined future with the South Slavs free from foreign rule. However, in the 1830s, under Ljubovitskaya, Croatian writers began, in reaction to the Hungarian language creeping into Croatia, argued for Croatian to be revived, more autonomy, although not necessarily independence, from Hungary, the protection of Croatian in schools, and the Croatian language to be standardized. The Illyrians, as they grew in strength, were aided by the Austrians, who viewed the Illyrians as a useful counterweight to Hungarian nationalism that was threatening the unity of their empire. They initially were Pan-Slavs, advocating for Pan-Slav unity, but as time passed, they increasingly became more and more Croatian-centric. While quite popular, they did face pushback going into the 1840s from pro-Hungarian forces who viewed them as traitors to the Austrian crown, with several violent instances in 1845 between the Illyrians and pro-Hungarian forces. In 1848, Croatia and Hungary would come to blows. That year, revolution would sweep throughout Europe, Hungary included, where Hungarian liberals took charge demanding for liberal reforms, autonomy, and importantly, the Hungarian language to be respected and protected in the Kingdom of Hungary. This included Croatia. In response, Croatian revolutionaries began making their own demands, wanting the unification of all Croatian lands under a single administrative unit, a democratically elected Sabor, legal equality, an end to feudalism, and autonomy from Hungary. The Croatian revolutions would be led by Josip Jelačić, the military governor of Krajina, who also was an Illyrian. He was promoted to Ban of Croatia and ultimately served as a powerful counter-revolutionary force against the Hungarian revolutionaries, with the Croatian revolutionaries hoping their loyalty to the Habsburgs would see them rewarded. In September of 1848, Jelačić would lead Croatian forces into Hungary and would aid the Austrians and Russians in defeating the Hungarians. After the war, while serfdom was abolished, Croat revolutionaries weren't rewarded for their sacrifice to the emperor, and were actually cracked down on and their autonomy restricted even more, with the Sabor dissolved. Liberal reforms would finally be implemented in Croatia in the 1860s. Croatian lands were reorganized with the military frontier abolished, a thawing of democratic politics in the Austrian Empire, and limited autonomy allowed for Croatia, although Croatia was still divided between 3 administrative units. Istria was merged with parts of coastal Slovenia and Italy, Dalmatia was given its own status, and the rest of Croatia was merged into one unit. Croatia would see several different political movements spring up. Those friendly with Hungary formed the Unionist Party, while those who favored greater autonomy formed the Narodna Stranka, with the backing of the Illyrians. The Narodna Stranka would moderate, becoming the new Unionist Party in the 1880s, now dominated by Hungarian landlords, and began to grow as the largest party, but started to face opposition from several different factions. You had the Party of Rights, which represented radical Croatian nationalists who wanted an independent Croatia and would embrace xenophobic beliefs, not only on the Hungarians and Austrians who ruled over them, but also the Serbs and Slovenes who were viewed as degenerates and or Croats who had fallen from the Catholic Church. You also had the Pan-Yugoslavs, who wanted to unite the South Slavs together into one state, fearing the other powers in the region would divide and eat them up. These Pan-Yugoslavs, under a grand coalition of moderate rightist, breakoffs of the Narodna Stranka, and Serb moderates, managed to become a powerful player in the 1900s despite Hungarian crackdowns. In other parts of Croatia, Dalmatia and Istria, politics were divided between Croat, Serb, and Italian nationalists. Whichever nationalist group managed to take control of their local municipality got to work lifting up their own language, while suppressing other languages, closing down rivaling language schools. By the time World War I rolled around, Croats controlled Dalmatian politics, while in Istria they were gridlocked. Serbs, meanwhile, in Krajina began calling for unity with Serbia, fearing Croat dominance and encouraged by the Hungarians, who wanted to use the Serbs as a way to weaken Croatian nationalists. By the 1910s, Croat nationalists and Yugoslavism were both on the rise in Croatia, and ethnic tension was very clearly present. Let's touch up on some social and cultural developments. Croatia during this time urbanized as the infrastructure improved and limited industry was brought in. Zagreb in particular began to grow. The city began to develop from an old Roman settlement in the medieval ages, and once the Habsburgs took over, became the capital of civil administration of Croatia, although still dwarfed by other Croatian cities like Varaždin. Now with railroads connecting Zagreb to other parts of the Austrian Empire, it started to develop to becoming the largest city in Croatia by 1910. However, as the cities grew, the Croatian population in the countryside, particularly in Dalmatia, shrunk, as many left due to the decline of the shipbuilding industry. The economy continued to be almost entirely agricultural based, but other industries like timber and its limited manufacturing industries started to grow. Croatia's tourist industry actually started during this time, as Austrian elites started to recognize the beauty of the Croatian coast and seaside resorts started to be developed. Literacy increased from 20% in the mid-1800s to close to 50% by the 1910s. World War I would see Austrian rule end. By 1918, it was clear that Austria was not going to be winning the war. Towards the end of that year, the Sabor, dominated by pan-Slavic politicians, declared the state of Slovenes, Croats, and Serbs, which consisted of Slovenia, Croatia, and Bosnia. This state a couple days later voted to merge with Serbia and Montenegro, creating Yugoslavia. Most of Croatia would merge into the state, although Wisteria would fall into Italian hands who claimed it was rightfully Italian. The Kingdom of Yugoslavia was set up as a kingdom with the Serbian Karađorđević dynasty at the top, but with a parliamentary democracy present under a centralized state. Immediately, Croat politicians began to voice dissent. In many ways, the politics of Yugoslavia from 1918 to 1941 can be summarized as Croat federalism and separatism opposing Serb centralization. Croats quickly found their voice in the Croatian Peasants' Party, or HSS, headed by Stepan Radić. The HSS came to represent Croatian autonomists and Republicans and promised radical land reform for the peasants who received the right to vote for the first time. Radić was arrested in 1919 for protesting the creation of the new state, which saw him rise to popularity, viewed as a martyr to the Croatian cause by his supporters. The HSS often served as the largest opposition party to the Radical Party, which represented Serbian nationalists in the Kingdom of Yugoslavia. It would throughout the 1920s dominate politics in Croatia until 1928, when Radić was assassinated in parliament by a member of the Radical Party. This coincided with the king cracking down on political opponents, jailing dissidents, or forcing them into exile. The authorities would see the HSS play a role in the parliamentary opposition to the king, but it would lose its commanding position in Yugoslav politics and fail to bring about a federal model, which led many non-Serb peoples, and especially Croats, to grow increasingly dissatisfied with the king and Yugoslavia. Despite many Croats strongly disliking Yugoslavia, Croatia's economy actually did quite well during this period. Croatia throughout the Kingdom of Yugoslavia was one of the richer areas in the country, with a larger industrial base than Serbia and a growing middle class and urban base. These two groups would make up a large part of the new opposition to Yugoslav rule. Firstly, you had leftist and communist. These groups emerged from social democrats and trade unionists that started to spring up in the late 1800s. The communists actually in the 1920s did appear to be a serious force in Croatia, with the 1920 election seeing the communists emerge as the third largest party in Yugoslavia. Shortly after the election, the party would be banned, forced underground, and regularly targeted, but by the mid-30s the communists began to reorganize, headed by Croatian Josip Broz Tito. The second rising force in Croatia would be various Croatian nationalists. These primarily were ex-members of the Party of Rights who were forced out of the country and began plotting for the overthrow of the Yugoslav state. They were radicalized both by the death of Radić and the rise of fascism across Europe. Most notable of these Croatian nationalists would be the Ustaša, or Rise Up. The Ustaša were founded in 1929 by Ante Pavlović. They argued for the violent overthrow of the Yugoslav state and a new pure corporatist and fascist Croatian state to be formed. They wanted all non-Croats to be expunged, in particular the Serbs, Jews, and Roma. They also had a funky view on Muslims or Bosniaks, viewing them as Croats who had converted to Islam to escape Ottoman persecution. The Ustaša began organizing terrorist attacks against the Yugoslav state, with them famously working with the IMRO in killing Yugoslav King Alexander in 1934. They began to find a support base in the urban and middle classes, but by 1940 they were still a pretty small group, mostly found in exile. Despite Yugoslav efforts to avoid war with the Axis, in April 1941 Germany invaded Yugoslavia and took over the entire country. Several days after the invasion, the Ustaša announced over the radio the creation of the independent state of Croatia, or NDH. The Nazis and Italians decided to back this new state, hoping that the Ustaša could govern the region for them without wasting resources they needed for war with the Soviet Union. The independent state was given the green light by the Axis, although they were ordered to have the Italian prince, Aimon, the Duke of Aosta, be king of this new state, and for parts of Dalmatia to be handed over to Italy, although they were still allowed the rest of Croatia and Bosnia. The Ustaša initially were fairly unknown to the Croatian public, with only a couple thousand members, mostly immigrants, when they took over the country. However, they quickly grew to around 100,000 members. They were largely aided by Croat frustrations with years of Serb and foreign rule, and with the support of the Catholic Church in Croatia. Alencin Stepinac, the Archbishop of Zagreb, famously worked with Ustaše and was very sympathetic towards the NDH's social conservative policies, such as banning provocative pictures of women and sending people to prison for swearing in public or working on Sunday. The Ustaše, with the backing of the Nazis, began one of the most genocidal campaigns in Europe during World War II. The Ustaše, in their mission to purify the Croat nation, took to forcing Serbs and Jews to wear armbands, identifying them as non-Croat. Quickly after taking power, Ustaše militias took to raiding and pillaging in their territory to either force the Serb, Jewish, and Roma population to flee into German-held Serbia or to be exterminated. Converting to Catholicism did spare some, but half the time this just resulted in the Ustaše killing them shortly afterwards, in order to send them up to heaven. Death camps like Janovitz were set up to help facilitate the slaughter of non-Croat undesirables and political dissidents. The end of the war saw hundreds of thousands killed in the Ustaše reign of terror, with something like 1/6 of the Serb population, 4/5 of the Croatian Jewish community, and almost all of the Roma community eliminated. Right-wing opposition to the Ustaše came from both the Yugoslav government in exile and the Chetniks. The government in exile was made up of King Peter II and several government ministers, but it only really provided diplomatic support to the Allies. The Chetniks, on the other hand, were prominent in Yugoslavia. They were a Serb force fighting for either a pre-1941 Yugoslavia or for a Greater Serbia. They took to massacring Croat and non-Serb villages as retaliation for the Ustaše's crimes. They, however, quickly began working with Ustaše and the Axis in fighting the last resistance group, the Communist Partisans. The Partisans, headed by Tito, quickly began gaining strength, aided by several different factors. Firstly, they were backed by their traditional support base of urban workers and the intelligentsia. Admittedly, this wasn't a massive bulk of the population, but it did provide a good base to build their force up. They also quickly received a lot of support from women, who hoped for greater equality under their progressive rule, with almost 20% of all partisan fighters being women, and many Croats who were living in Italian-controlled Dalmatia backed them. Here, which hurt the Ustaše's image as defenders of the Croat nation. Something like 22% of all partisans were Croat. The partisans were aided by the brutality of the Ustaše and Chetniks, which drove many towards the partisans, who promised a multi-ethnic democracy free from the genocide the other groups were promoting. They did also see some support from the Allied powers, albeit not until late into the war. While fighting was fierce and the partisans were almost eliminated at several points, the partisans continued to use the mountains as cover for their operations and grew in strength, slowly liberating more and more of their country. By 1945, it was clear the NDH was not going to survive the war, and quickly Ustaše members began fleeing or defecting. The last days of the war saw partisans massacre tens of thousands of Ustaše militiamen, their collaborators, and non-cooperative civilians. Briefly, before we leave World War II, the historical legacy of the war continues to loom large over Croatia. In Croatia, there is a decent subset of the population who view the Ustaše as Croatian heroes who have fought for Croatian independence and/or have tried to minimize the genocide carried out by the Ustaše. As you will see, future communist repression towards Croatia, Croatian nationalists taking charge in the 90s, and then Serbian nationalists also taking charge in Serbia during that same time period, helped give fuel to these attitudes. Robert Kaplan, writing in his book Balkan Ghost in 1993, says, quote, "Nowhere in Europe is a legacy of Nazi war crimes so unresolved as it is in Croatia," unquote. This has led both during the Yugoslav wars and even today, ethnic tension to remain pretty high between Croats and its ethnic Serb population and the Serbian state. There have been efforts made by historians and authorities in recent years to bring more attention to this time period, but you can still find various far-right groups and revisionist historians in the country that argue against any acknowledgement towards the Ustaše's crimes. In 1946, with the war over, the Federal People's Republic of Yugoslavia was declared. Yugoslavia was rebuilt with 6 republics: Macedonia, Serbia, Montenegro, Bosnia, Slovenia, and Croatia, with the Socialist Republic of Croatia corresponding to the modern-day borders of Croatia today. Yugoslavia saw major economic industries nationalized, grain prices fixed by the government, churches, banks, and foreign businesses had their land expropriated, and the People's Front, a communist popular front, was set up that saw anyone in a union, a social sector job, a personal association, or even just a sports club automatically incorporated into it. Land reform was carried out in its early years. Opponents to the communist government were jailed or forced out. Many of those who left in the first days of communist rule were Ustaše members, and many formed Croatian nationalist organizations in exile that ranged from pressure groups to terrorist organizations plotting to restore the NDH. Many of those leaving Croatia would also be from Croatia's Italian community, who were forced out of Styria after the war. Yugoslavia was at first an ally to the USSR, which isn't surprising. Both were communist states. However, it is important to note that unlike many other communist states in Eastern Europe, the Yugoslav communists were able to liberate their country largely on their own. with limited support from outside powers. This made them much more independent and more willing to engage in their own policy goals. Eventually, by 1948, there was a clear break between Stalin and Tito. This saw Yugoslavia move closer to the West and saw it help form the non-aligned movement, although friendly relations with the Soviets started to pick back up in the mid-50s. Yugoslavia's geopolitical position of friendly with the West, although not a part of NATO or the capitalist bloc, meant that the country was able to get Western funds into the country, which helped prop up the economy. The most radical communist proposals were shot down or met with more internal opposition, and many pro-Soviet politicians, both those with outward or suspected sympathies, were jailed. Yugoslav communism was styled as a self-management system. This was supposed to be a system that had the workers managing their own affairs and was, unlike the Soviet system, not as heavily bureaucratized, at the very least in theory. This often meant in practice that many communes throughout the country had a high degree of importance, although most power still remained at the top with Tito and his allies. While Yugoslav communists claimed they were more ideologically pure than their Soviet counterparts, they, funnily enough, allowed, along with Western aid money, some foreign companies to actually start operating in the country, and some limited market reforms to take place. Croatia started to see in the 50s and 60s major industrialization and urbanization as the economy moved away from a solely agricultural model. Living standards improved, literacy went up, Western culture like rock and roll was brought in, and Croatia slowly became an economic powerhouse in Yugoslavia, contributing more money to the federal budget than it was taking out. This ended up becoming a source of tension as Croatia began to feel it was being used by other poorer republics, like Serbia. Over time, Yugoslav politics became divided between the technocrats, who dominated politics in Croatia, who wanted to see even further market and liberal reforms, and the old guard, who opposed such reformers and wanted a more centralized Yugoslavia. This tension wasn't helped by a period of free expression being more open, which saw more criticism towards the regime, Serbian domination in the police force of Croatia, and suggestions that Croatian was simply a dialect of Serbian. In 1971, students in Zagreb, with the backing of several members of the Croatian Communist Party, began demanding more autonomy for Croatia within Yugoslavia, even asking for Croatia to get its own seat in the UN. This period, known as the Croatian Spring, would be cut short, as the old guard and Tito feared that the Croatian Spring might lead to civil war or the breakup of Yugoslavia, and so cracked down. High-level leaders of the Croatian communists were forced to step down, while student leaders were arrested and forced into exile. Reformers were eliminated in Croatia, and conservatives took charge of the Croatian communists. This crackdown failed, however, to solve the root issue of Yugoslavia's framework needing reform. As time went by, Yugoslavia's economy became propped up more by political patronage and corruption. This didn't help when, by the late 70s to early 80s, Yugoslavia's high debt from all the foreign loans it was taking in led to inflation. While Tito had been a popular figure who could help unify the Yugoslavs, his death in 1980 meant one of the few uniting figures in the state was gone. The leaders in the federal republics began taking a more important role, which led to heightened ethnic tension. While at first Slovenes would lead the charge for greater autonomy, by the mid-80s, Croatia would also become, like back in the 60s, a major proponent of decentralization. At this point, we should talk about the father of modern Croatian independence, Franjo Tudman. Tudman had actually been active with the Yugoslav communists going all the way back to 1942, with Tudman fighting with the partisans. He rose through the ranks in Yugoslavia's military and became a historian until the Croatian Spring, where he expressed support for the protesters, which led to him being jailed and saw him lean much more into dissident Croatian nationalism. He in 1989 would found with other Croatian nationalists the Croatian Democratic Union, or HDZ. He quickly became a popular figure in Croatia. As Yugoslavia started coming apart more and more, liberal reforms were introduced, multi-party elections were held in early 1990, which saw the HDZ win a plurality of the vote and a majority of the seats, with the communists and liberals remaining on the sidelines. This greatly concerned the Serb minority in Croatia. The HDZ, while it wasn't a fascist organization, it was soft on the legacy of the Ustaše, and had a large degree of support of Croat nationalists abroad, and once in office, purged Serbs from the government, and renamed streets after Ustaše figures. Quickly, the Serbian press began calling Tudman and his HDZ allies the new Ustaše, and with Serbian politicians preaching Serbian nationalist rhetoric, both Croatian and Serbian leaders were quickly at each other's throats. Tudman had about 3 months before Yugoslavia completely broke apart. Municipalities with a large Serb population began de facto breaking away, forming their own new autonomous zones without the republic's approval. Both these Serb breakaways and the Croatian government began stocking up on arms and ammunition, and highways were blocked with logs to prevent the Croatian government from entering into Serb zones. ethnic tension bubbled to the surface as riots broke out, police and radio stations were seized, and all Croats were accused of being Ustaše, while all Serbs were accused of being Chetniks by nationalists in both camps. Serb forces were backed by the Yugoslav army, who at one point threatened to shoot down a Croatian military helicopter that was going to send special forces into Kern, the heart of the Serb insurrection. In August, several Serbian autonomous oblasts were declared in Krajina, Western Slavona, and along the Croatian-Serb border. And in May of 1991, Croatia declared its independence from Yugoslavia. By early 1991, violence ramped up even more, and even though war was never formally declared, the start of the Croatian War of Independence had begun. At the start of 1991, around one-third of Croatia was in rebel hands, under a breakaway state known as the Republic of Serbian Krajina. The Serbs began shelling Croat cities and launched an offensive into Croatia. Croat forces in turn captured isolated Yugoslav military posts and attempted to halt the Serb advance in Dubrovnik and, famously, Vukovar. For almost 3 months, the outnumbered Croat forces in the city were able to prevent the Yugoslav army from advancing into Croatia and helped give vital time for the Croatian army to prepare and killed the momentum of the Serb advance. The city's defense, and in particular the water tower in the city, became an important cultural symbol for Croatian defiance against Serb aggression. The siege of Vukovar also saw a massacre of the Croat population by Serb forces. Massacres, looting, ethnic cleansing, and mass vandalism and rape became very common during the Yugoslav wars, with massacres of Croats at Skabrna and Serbs at Gospić. This first period of the War of Croatian Independence would end with a ceasefire in 1992, although small-scale skirmishes and shelling continued. Internationally, Croatia found support primarily from Catholic countries and Germany. However, by the end of the Gulf War, and with increasing news reports of Serb massacres in Bosnia, Western powers also began backing the Croats, with at first just diplomatic support and then military equipment. At first, Croatia was sympathetic to the Bosnian cause against Serb aggression. However, with the ceasefire in 1992, Croat nationalists began eyeing Bosnia, attacking and sieging several towns, wanting a greater Croatia to be established. It is even rumored Tudman and Serbian President Slobodan Milosevic agreed to divide up Bosnia. However, by early 1994, conflict between Bosnia and Croat forces halted, and Croatia got back to backing the Bosnians. The Croatian army was being established from the police and National Guard units, although Croats like the Serbs and Bosnians relied on ad hoc militias and paramilitaries who tended to be radical Croatian nationalists. Also fighting for the Croats would actually be around 10,000 Croat Serbs who sided with Zagreb. By late 1994, the tide had begun to turn from Serbia. In 1995, Croat forces launched Operation Flash and then Storm, which saw the Croat military take almost all of Serbian Krajina from rebel hands. In November, a peace agreement was signed between Croatia and the remnants of Serbian Krajina, bringing the war to a close. The war's end saw around 200,000 Serbs forced out of the country. Croatia entered the war with 1/5 of the country as non-Croat and roughly 12% as Serb, to less than 10% as non-Croat and 4% of the population being ethnic Serbians by war's end. Around 20,000 people were killed in the war, likely a majority of the dead civilians, and hundreds of thousands were displaced. Tudman, as Croatia's president, ended the war and gave Croatia independence. He became for many a legendary figure in Croatian history, along the lines of Ulysses, or, and as an American example, George Washington. He attempted to westernize the country, privatizing the economy and breaking up state monopolies. These ended up mostly being sold to loyal allies of Tudman. Tudman's corruption was able to somewhat slip by, as most major news outlets were directly controlled by the HDZ, and electoral laws were restructured to benefit the HDZ. While the opposition was able to win the 1997 Zagreb mayoral election, Tudman prevented the new mayor from taking over and attempted to shut down several opposition radio stations in the country. His popularity eventually started to wane until he passed away in December of 1999. Since 2000, Croatian politics have been dominated by two parties, the HDZ and the Social Democratic Party, or SDP. The SDP was formed from ex-communist and represents center-left social democratic thought. It came to power in the first election after Tudman and ruled until 2003. It would regain power in 2011 and ruled until 2015. Every other government in Croatia has been headed by the HDZ. The HDZ has somewhat moderated and became a respectable, center-right conservative party, and has really dominated politics in the country. It could be called the natural ruling party of the country, considering its powerful political position and its long time in government. Other parties do exist, serving as allies or pressure groups to the other major parties at the national or local level. There are various small liberal and centrist parties found throughout the country, a resurgent but rump HSS, several parties representing minority interests in the country, new progressive and leftist parties, several alternative, conservative, and populist groups, and finally Croatian nationalist, with the current government an alliance of the HDZ, several small liberal allies of the HDZ, and the Homeland Movement, a Croatian nationalist party. The current government is headed by HDZ politician and Prime Minister Andrej Plenković, who has run the country since 2016. After Tudman's death, most of the president's power was transferred over to the Prime Minister. Plenković has increased cooperation with the EU, which Croatia joined in 2013. While he has been seen as a moderate and been in government previously with a party representing the Serb minority of the country from 2016 to 2024, he, following the latest election in April of 2024, joined up with Croatian nationalists, so this latest HDZ government is likely going to be more right-leaning than other governments in the past. Plenković will have a powerful counterweight in Zoran Milanović, the president of Croatia. While the prime minister is the most powerful political figure in the country, the president does have a lot of symbolic importance and can call for elections and has some sway in foreign policy. Milanović, elected with SDP support, formerly was the prime minister from 2011 to 2016, was elected president in 2020, and has opposed Croatia backing Ukraine in its war with Russia. Still, the country is firmly in the Western Bloc, with it joining NATO in 2009. Croatia's economy, while still keeping century-old traditions like winemaking, has also branched out, and tourism in particular has grown. Something like a third of the economy is based just around tourism, which has grown from a minor part of the economy in the 19th and 20th century into a major industry. Tourism in Croatia is largely based around the coast, although Zagreb's Old Town and many museums, and dark tourism in the north are also present. While this has helped the Croatian economy grow and put it on the map, it does come with its problems, with tourism benefiting the coast far more than the rural interior, and tourism being very seasonal based, which means a bad tourist season can significantly hurt the economy. Croats' standards of living have remained somewhat stagnant since independence, and this, along with the heavy reliance on the tourism industry, high unemployment for young people, and Croatia joining the EU, has meant a lot of Croats have left the country, moving into other EU countries or going further abroad to America or elsewhere. Since 1990, the population has decreased by about 1 million people. Admittedly, some of this can be explained by the war, but also a lot of it can be explained by people leaving the country and choosing not to have children. Still, Croatia remains a relatively well-off country, with it being mostly politically stable, and corruption, which, while present, has been going down. So why does Croatia exist? Croatia was at first formed as a duchy in the 800s by the Hrvati, who had moved into the region and quickly, due to the Carolingians, fell under the influence of the Western Church, helping distinguish them from their Bosnian and Serbian neighbors. While Croatia, for almost 1,000 years from 1097 to 1991, remained under foreign control, the Croats continued. Despite Ottoman raids, the military frontier, Magyarization, World War II, and the Yugoslav wars, the Croats endured. The Illyrians in the 1800s birthed the first Croat nationalists, who, while always were influential and popular, were only able to give Croatia true independence in the 90s, fueled by resentment towards those that ruled them, the Austrians, Hungarians, Ottomans, Yugoslavs, Nazis, and at that time, communists. This long history continues to greatly influence the country today, but with independence now at hand, hopefully the country will see brighter days ahead of it. Up next, we go to Cuba. Prepare for the Spanish, the Americans, communism, and a lot of hot takes on Castro by just about everyone. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. Sorry this took a little bit. I read about 4 books for this project, which is typically a little bit more than I normally read. But I think it helped me out a lot. I will be glad once it's finally edited and out there in the world. That'll make me very, very happy. But up next, I will do Mexican political parties, then I will do the history of Cuba, and then I will do Iraqi political parties. So thanks for listening, thanks for watching. If you want, you can email me at whydocountriesexist@gmail.com for your thoughts, suggestions, or hate mail. Take care, I hope you have a wonderful rest of your day. The sources I use for this episode are Leslie Benson's Yugoslavia, A Concise History, Benjamin Curtis's A Traveler's History of Croatia, Geography Now's video on Croatia, Robert Kaplan's Balkan Ghost, Professor James Kerr-Lindsey's video on Operation Storm, Christopher Merritt's Only Nails Remain, and finally, Wikipedia.